So I recently read this book. This is News of the Dead by Mary Hooper. It's the true tale of the girl who survived the gallows. And as soon as I started this, I knew that one day very soon I was going to have to make an episode all about the story within these pages. If you know of a teenager who's very interested in history, I just generally really recommend all of Mary Hooper's books. I genuinely think Mary Hooper and the Horrible Histories books are the reason why I am so interested in history to this very day. It's such easy to sort of digest historical content without ever being too heavy, and it teaches you about some really interesting historical moments. I probably never would have heard of Anne Green if I hadn't read this book last month. This is going to be a very sad story today. It's one which kind of encapsulates the treatment of women throughout history, but it's also a story of hope, because Anne Green should have died, but she didn't. At 22 years old, she survived her own execution. But how did she end up in that position? That's what I'm here to tell you. For this historical case today, we're travelling back to the 17th century, to the mid-1600s, and as is often the case when talking about things that happened so long ago, we don't know loads about the life of Anne Green up until the events leading to her execution. We know she was born in 1628 in Oxfordshire, and that is about it. She probably lived the standard life for a girl in this time with little education. She was raised to work as a housemaid and just send money back to her family at home. Maybe one day she would marry up, provided she lived a life free of scandal, provided she was a respectable woman. At some point, Anne was employed as a maid at an extravagant manor house in Duns Tew, just south of Banbury in Oxfordshire, by Sir Thomas Reed. He was the High Sheriff of Berkshire, Oxfordshire and Hertfordshire, and he was knighted in 1619 and was just generally a member of high society. It's even thought he entertained King Charles I and Queen Henrietta on multiple occasions. Sir Thomas Reed was very much a man of this time period, a man of a strongly patriarchal society. And you could probably argue he was not a good man. One of Sir Thomas Reed's grandsons was a teenage boy called Geoffrey Reed, and it seems like whilst at Duns Tew, he took a bit of a shine to scullery maid Anne Green. Now obviously there was a massive power imbalance here. Geoffrey Reed one day to take over his grandfather's power, and Anne Green just a maid, no doubt hoping one day to marry rich, to help herself and her family. A woman's place in society all depended on who she married. So when Master Geoffrey Reed starts making promises to naive Anne about the life they can live together, marriage and riches, Anne eventually gives in to what he wants. They started sleeping together. The jury seems to be out online as to whether or not this was consensual. There's no way of knowing now, but remember this was the 1600s. But Anne definitely seems to have been coerced in some way. She would have been lied to most likely, told that he was going to marry her one day. And then, as you might expect, Anne fell pregnant. Once again, it's not known for sure whether or not Anne was aware of her situation, but some reports do say that she didn't know she was pregnant until at 6 months along, she miscarried. She started one day getting pains while she was stirring a vat of malt, and she runs to what they called back in this time the House of Office. She ran to the outhouse, the toilet. She gave birth in the outhouse to a stillborn tiny baby boy, said to be no bigger than the size of her hand, and she panicked. She knew she couldn't go back into the house with this stillborn. She would be disgraced for having sex before marriage, and so she did the only thing she could think to do in this moment. She buried the body near a cesspit. However, it seems the other servants had suspicions about what had been going on. The body was soon found and Anne was reported to Sir Thomas. This wealthy family, knowing the shame that this could bring, their grandson impregnating a scullery maid, just pulled ranks. There was no pity, no sympathy for what Anne had gone through, just an attempt to ensure that no blame came back on them, the Reeds, for what had happened. Sir Thomas became determined to prosecute Anne for her horrible crime of a stillbirth, having her arrested and tried for infanticide under the Concealment of Birth of Bastards Act of 1624. This law had been passed just 4 years before Anne's own birth, prosecuting women whose babies had died, unless they could make proof by at least one witness that the child whose death was concealed was born dead. This law was the first of its kind in English law. We know the whole basis of the justice system is innocent until proven guilty, but this law was the first in which a woman was presumed guilty unless she could be proven innocent. In practice, this law was only really going to affect unmarried lower class women. Upper class women would always have somebody to vouch for them because money talks. Lower class women like Anne Green had no way to prove anything to make her case. As soon as Sir Thomas decided to prosecute Anne for this, there was no way she was coming out of it alive unless there was a miracle. This law, women being prosecuted for stillbirth, something they have literally no control over, sounds oddly familiar to some laws which are passing in certain places nowadays. This sounds like it should be something that should have stayed in the 1600s, but it hasn't. It's coming back around. What's that saying about repeating history? Of course, Geoffrey Reed didn't receive much heat for his part in this, for his lies and what would probably today be considered as sexual assault. He was simply snuck out of the country before the trial and he wasn't really heard from again. Sir Thomas clearly wasn't happy with him though, because in his later will, Geoffrey would only receive a single farm in Northampton, when previously he probably would have received a hell of a lot more than that. The criminal justice system back in the 1600s moved a lot faster than it does nowadays apparently, because Anne was almost immediately arrested for this and transported to Oxford Jail, where she would be held for 3 weeks before her trial. She was 22 years old, scared, her hormones probably all over the place considering what had just happened to her, and shoved into this jail. She was also described as being horribly ill and weak in the aftermath of this birth. Jails in the 1650s were multiple people shoved into a single cell, rats gnawing on those too depressed or ill to move, rotting flesh and food, no sunlight. I can't imagine Anne would have fared too well in there. And then her trial came around, at which point Anne would probably have known that she had no hope of living. She was a simple scullery maid with the Reeds after her blood, with their wealth, reputation and power. Anne wouldn't have had the means to defend herself properly at all. Infanticide wasn't a crime that was taken lightly in these times, and even though the medical evidence at trial proved beyond doubt that the baby had been stillborn, that it had never taken a single breath, it didn't matter. The Reeds wanted a certain verdict, and that's what they got. Anne Green was sentenced to death. On the 14th of December 1650, Anne was taken to the gallows to meet her death. Although in today's media, execution by hanging is often depicted to be quick and instant, the neck breaking as soon as the trapdoor below opens, that was rarely the case in reality. Anne's hanging likely didn't have a trapdoor at all. A lot of the times what would happen is criminals would simply have to be left hanging for an extended period of time before they actually died. So often they'd request that family members speed along the process by pulling on their legs and beating on their chest. And that's thought to be what happened in Anne's case. Her family helped speed along the process. According to contemporary accounts, Anne kicked and twitched for nearly half an hour until she stopped. The executioner, finally thinking that she was gone, cut her down. But even after that, she was seen to still be breathing, so a man who stood nearby stamped on her chest and stomach as hard as he could, thinking that he was doing a good deed by putting her out of her misery. She was treated the same way many would treat an animal today. Anne's body was placed in a coffin, and in a stroke of luck, she wasn't taken to be buried. No, Anne Green's body was to be dissected for medical science. Her body was delivered to William Petty, a surgeon and researcher at the Anatomy School at Oxford University. He was ready to conduct the dissection for 30 medical students, all waiting in anticipation. But he immediately noticed that for a dead girl, Anne's body was still unusually warm. There was still life there. She was breathing ever so faintly. And luckily for Anne, she was in a room full of doctors, so they did what they did best. They treated her. They tried to bring her back to life. William Petty and Thomas Willis seemed to be the main 2 doctors responsible for this. They poured hot and cordial spirits into Anne's mouth, which caused her to cough, another sign of life. It was a miracle. She'd been hanging for half an hour, so of course they were going to try and bring her back. Although she didn't have full rigor mortis because she wasn't dead, her body was still very stiff, so they got the medical students to massage and rub her limbs for 15 minutes whilst they administered more spirits. They did whatever they could to get a reaction out of Anne, so they tickled her with a feather on the throat, which prompted her to open her eyes very briefly. And then, in a very 1600s medical technique, they drew blood. Any old-timey doctor worth their salts would draw blood. That was the answer to all ailments. The doctors knew they had to raise Anne's temperature, so they placed her in a warmed bed, they applied spirits and oils to her body, they gave her a hot water enema and placed heat onto her chest. They then managed to convince another woman to lie in the bed with her and gently rub her limbs, anything to warm Anne up. I liked that last point when I read it. Anne, so abused by men, put to death because of men, being brought back to life by a woman. The doctors knew not to abuse her body in any way, so they asked a woman to get in the bed with her. It was just something sweet in what should have been her final moments. After a while, their efforts paid off and Anne came around. Just 14 hours later, she was well enough to speak and hold conversations. Some would report that she recalled being in a fine green meadow with a river running around it, and that all things there glittered like silver and gold. Others would later refute that she ever said anything to that effect, that in reality she remembered nothing between leaving the prison and then waking up, only a very fleeting memory of the hangman, which is probably for the best. Within just one day, Anne was holding full conversations. Despite being hung by the neck for 30 minutes, her brain seemed unaffected by the trauma, both physical and emotional. In a few days, she was well enough to eat chicken, and eventually, against all odds, she made a full recovery. In a religious society and survival, her coming back from the dead was seen as an intervention from God. He clearly had other plans and protected her. Maybe some of the more religious today would still see it that way, but what's the scientific explanation here? How did Anne Green really survive the gallows? Well, there are probably multiple things at play here that saved her life. As I said earlier, the instrument of hanging in those days was merely a noose from a tree or a scaffold with no trapdoor underneath. Rather than fall and have their neck broken, criminals would simply have to suffocate to death, helped along by a knot pre-tied into the rope that would press into the windpipe. It was suggested in Anne's case that the knot was actually incorrectly placed, and that instead of pressing into the windpipe, it may have actually taken pressure off it. She was a 22-year-old woman. She would have been smaller than the majority of criminals that passed through the gallows, who would have mostly been men. The knot may have been perfectly placed for the larger males passing through, but not for smaller Anne. The fact that she was a woman may well have saved her life. It was also incredibly cold on the 14th of December 1650. Now I can't give you exact temperatures, but sources do say it was unusually freezing, and this may well have saved her brain. Because even in a case where it was just the knot, Anne's brain would still have been slowly starved of oxygen, which in most cases would cause irreversible brain damage. But Anne's brain may have been frozen, something very similar to sort of suspended animation, and therefore was prevented of being starved of oxygen. In a hypothermic, freezing state, her body just needed less oxygen to survive. Everything on this day just perfectly lined up to save her life. Her body being slowly warmed up along with the external massage helped her come back to life. Maybe it was a miracle, but science definitely seemed to have a part to play here. After making a full recovery, Anne was simply allowed to go home. Law stated at the time that if you survived an execution, that was divine intervention. You didn't have to go back to the gallows, God said no. William Petty and the other doctors involved in the resurrection, though, did lobby the Sheriff of Oxford for a full pardon for Anne, which was obtained because, again, divine intervention. Ironically, Sir Thomas Reed had previously served as the county sheriff himself, but in what seems to be a weird strike of karma, within just days of Anne's failed execution, Sir Thomas Reed suddenly died himself, so he couldn't exactly object to the pardon. It was allowed to go through. In the aftermath of Anne's survival, herself and her doctors went on to achieve countrywide renown. The story grew great interest from anyone who heard it. And the story caught the attention of pamphleteers who spread it far and wide. Richard Watkins, an Oxford scholar who was present at the revival, wrote a pamphlet entitled News of the Dead, just like the book, a true and exact narration of the miraculous deliverance of Anne Green. The pamphlet doesn't talk about this being an act of God, divine intervention. It focuses on the medical care given by the doctors, on their knowledge, and that was quite amazing for the time. The doctors skated through the rest of their careers on the back of this. However, Anne and her family now had some pretty big medical fees to pay, as well as fees to pay the sheriff for her pardon. Everywhere she went, she drew attention. Everyone wanted to see the woman who escaped death, the woman that God saved. So Petty and Willis just suggested that she make people pay for the pleasure of seeing her, so at least she could pay them and for her lodgings. So she did. She made people come and pay to see her, and to see her coffin, I believe. You've got to make the best of a bad situation, and at least now she didn't have to worry about money. After she'd made a full recovery, Anne moved back to the countryside with her family to Steeple Barton. It's even said that she took her coffin with her as a souvenir and as a reminder. She would go on to marry a man called John Taylor of Duns Tew soon after, a man that she must have known before this ordeal, and together they went on to have 3 children. She died in 1665 at age 37, and it's believed that in a cruel twist of fate, she actually died in childbirth. So there you go, that is the story of Anne Green, the girl who survived death. I just couldn't not record an episode about her after I read that book. It was so fascinating. Let me know in the comments down below if you think the reason she survived was divine intervention or science. If you think there might have been another scientific reason as to why she was able to survive this. I'm always happy to have these conversations with you in the comments. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.